Any year in the dust-choked plains of the American West, where the sun bled gold across endless prairies and wind whistled through skeletal trees, life was a raw and unrelenting teacher. In the heart of a town scarred by drought and the sorrow of broken families, the wooden platform of the town square creaked beneath the weight of judgment, greed, and desperation. Today, it groaned with something darker, cruelty. The auction was no stranger to tears, but it thrived on them. Families arrived with hope, or at least with the illusion of it. Fathers who had lost work, widows who had lost husbands, children orphaned by sickness or accident, every soul weighed and measured, priced for survival. Yet among these, a different kind of terror hummed in the air. The children, the unloved, the unwanted, the discarded, they shuffled in ragged clothes, eyes wide and wary, as the auctioneer's voice sliced through the bitter wind. Next, the word snapped like a whip. A girl of 13 with a mop of tangled brown hair stepped forward. Her shoulders, though small, bore the invisible weight of starvation and neglect. Her name was Clara. She clutched a threadbare blanket around her chest, her eyes flickering toward the crowd, searching for a flicker of mercy in a sea of hardened faces. No one offered it. Beside her, a boy named Eli 9 trembled as he counted the coins the buyers held. His mother had died a year before of fever, his father long gone to gambling debts. He had learned early to fold his despair into a mask of obedience. Each child, Clara, Eli, Maggie, Sammy, Tobias, Nina, Jack, and the others, carried stories no one would care to hear, histories of loss, of hunger gnawing at their bellies more fiercely than the winter wind. The auctioneer's gavel slammed, breaking the silence with a sound more terrifying than any shout. Sold, and the children, like packages of sorrow, were claimed one by one. Whispers slithered through the crowd. Who would buy the unwanted, and why would anyone? Many bidders were men hardened by loss, by profit, by a life that had dulled their compassion. The children's fate was an open ledger, and cruelty wrote every line. At the edge of the square, a man watched quietly, his tall frame almost blending with the shadows of the low sun. His coat, dark and worn, bore the soft, gray dust of the trail. His eyes, stormy and deep, betrayed the kind of grief that could silence towns. He was Jonathan Hayes, widower, childless, and haunted by a loss that had hollowed him from the inside out. His wife, Mary, had died 4 years prior, leaving a silence so thick he could still feel it breathing in the corners of his cabin. They had dreamed of children, but sickness and cruel fate had denied them. His sorrow had carved him into a man who no longer sought comfort for himself. Yet here, before the auction, he felt the stirrings of something new, something impossible. The first child to be auctioned was Clara. Bidding started low. Men jeered, women averted their eyes. But Jonathan stepped forward, voice quiet but firm, rich with the kind of authority that silence had taught him. "I'll take her." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some laughed. The sheriff of the town, a portly man named Solomon Grady, narrowed his eyes. His disdain was thinly veiled. "You can't just claim her, Hayes. She isn't yours to save. This is business." Jonathan met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "She's human," he said simply. That was enough. A few coins clinked into the auctioneer's hand. Clara's wide eyes fixed on Jonathan, not understanding, yet sensing that he was different from the others. One by one, Jonathan claimed the children. Each had been abandoned or sold away by relatives who had no stomach or heart for them. Eli 9, Maggie 7, Sammy 6, Tobias 5, Nina 4, Jack 3, and 3 younger ones, infants clutched in their own thin blankets. For every coin Jonathan spent, the sheriff's scowl deepened, the townspeople muttered, and a wind of suspicion rose like the dust along the streets. The cruelty of the auction lingered long after the gavel fell. Some children cried, others simply stared, numb with disbelief. Jonathan gathered them into his arms where he could, their small bodies trembling against his coat, and whispered softly words that carried a warmth the children had not known. "You are safe now. I promise. No one can take you from me." It was a promise that felt monumental even to him. He had no cabin large enough, no supplies to feed 10 mouths, yet he saw in their eyes something he had not dared to feel for years: hope. The journey home was harsh. Snow had fallen in sheets, turning the prairie into a white expanse of merciless cold. Jonathan wrapped each child in blankets, sharing the small warmth of his own body, urging them to hold tight to each other. He lifted those too small to walk, trudged through the frost, and shielded them from the whip of wind that seemed determined to drive life from their bodies. By nightfall, they reached his cabin, a small log structure with a stone chimney that barely gave off heat. He stacked firewood, coaxed flames from dry tinder, and fed the children what little he had. The warmth of the fire danced across their pale faces, and for the first time in days, they felt the hush of safety. Clara, wide-eyed and cautious, was the first to speak. Why are you helping us?" Jonathan paused, looking at the faces of children so innocent yet so scarred. "Because," he said, his voice breaking, "someone should. Because no child deserves this. Not anyone." The sheriff, meanwhile, rode through town the next day, muttering to merchants and neighbors that Hayes had overstepped, that the children were a burden, that the town's order had been disrupted. He wanted to shame Jonathan into giving them back. But the man refused to be cowed. "They are mine now," he said, "and I will protect them." Word of Jonathan's defiance spread, and while many townsfolk murmured criticism, a few brave souls quietly offered aid. Among them was Martha, the town's midwife, a woman of 50 with hair streaked silver and hands that had healed more than her share of broken bones and spirits. She brought extra blankets, warm broth, and even some toys she had patched from scraps. "You're doing what is right," she told Jonathan, eyes glistening. "They need you and you need them. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." At night, as the wind shrieked against the cabin walls and snow piled high against the door, Jonathan watched the children sleep. They were tangled in blankets, small bodies huddled together for warmth, faces softened in the first slumber free from fear. He remembered Mary, his wife, her gentle voice in the evenings, her laughter by the hearth. If she had lived, she would have loved them instantly. And in a quiet corner of his heart, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps he could honor her memory by being the father they never had. The children were learning, slowly, to trust. Tobias, 5, finally laughed at a small joke Jonathan made about the stubborn goat tied outside. Maggie, 7, offered her tiny fingers to help light the fire. Even Jack, the youngest, nestled against Jonathan's chest without fear. The harshness of the auction, the cruelty of neglect, the biting cold of the winter prairie, these were slowly being replaced by warmth, security, and the strange new feeling of belonging. Jonathan realized that while the town might judge him, while the sheriff might fume, the children's hearts were growing. And in that growth, his own grief found a strange, redeeming echo. For every smile, every word of thanks, every tear of relief, Jonathan felt as though he were rebuilding not just their lives, but his own fractured spirit. Yet shadows lingered. The sheriff would not relent, and whispers of jealousy and suspicion weaved through the town. Jonathan knew that claiming the children was only the first step, keeping them safe, teaching them, loving them in a world that had shown them nothing but neglect. That would be the true trial. That night, as snow whispered against the cabin windows and the children slept, Jonathan held Clara close. "I won't let anything hurt you," he promised. And in that vow, the first threads of a family, unexpected, unconventional, yet fierce in its bond, began to take hold. The story of Jonathan Hayes and the 10 unwanted children was only beginning. The West was cruel, the prairie merciless, but for the first time, there was a flicker of hope, a light that even the harshest wind could not extinguish. The first snow had hardened into ice, sharp and unyielding, clinging to the edges of Jonathan Hayes's cabin like a warning. Outside, the prairie stretched white and endless, the wind cutting through layers of wool and leather, turning breath into frost. Yet inside, the cabin was alive, a fragile hearth against the cruelty of the West. The children stirred, small shadows in the firelight, and Jonathan moved among them, checking blankets, mending torn clothing, distributing the thin rations Martha had provided. Clara had taken to organizing the younger ones. She would tuck Tobias into a corner, smooth the hair of Jack, and whisper encouragements to Sammy, who was only 6 but carried the kind of solemnity that seemed older than his years. "We have him now," she whispered once, as Jonathan stirred the fire. "He'll keep us safe." And indeed, Jonathan was their anchor. The sheriff, Solomon Grady, did not relent. Each day he rode past the cabin on his horse, eyes narrowed, lips pressing into a line that could cut wood. He whispered to the townsfolk that Hayes had taken more than he could care for, that the children would corrupt or starve under his untested hand. Some townspeople nodded, unsure or afraid. Others, like the butcher and the blacksmith, watched quietly, wary of conflict. But Jonathan ignored their murmurs. Each child saved was a battle won against cruelty and indifference. Life in the cabin was a blend of hardship and small victories. Jonathan built a lean-to for the animals, an old goat, a skeletal cow, and a flock of small lambs, which the children tended under his watchful gaze. He taught them how to gather firewood without risk, how to recognize edible roots in the snow-covered earth, how to keep warm with layered blankets and shared bodies. The smallest lessons became their survival skills. Every day, a measure of independence grew alongside their trust in him. Maggie, 7, was especially clever. She figured out how to mend their torn shoes with scraps of leather and twine, often offering her handiwork to the others. Eli, 9, had a quiet wisdom, a careful observer, who learned quickly where Jonathan hid supplies, which paths were safe in the snow, and how to avoid the sharpest winds. Tobias, mischievous and restless, often tried to sneak out with Jack, 3, in tow, but Jonathan's patient hand and calm voice kept them close. The harsh reality of the West, however, was never far. One night, a blizzard descended without warning. The wind tore through the cabin's cracks, and snow drifted along the floor, icy and sharp. Jonathan worked tirelessly, fortifying the walls, piling blankets around the children, and stoking the fire into a defiant roar. Jack's teeth chattered in his sleep. Nina, 4, whimpered, curling close to Clara's legs. Jonathan's own body ached from lifting frozen logs and carrying the smaller ones, yet he did not falter. Through the storm, a knock came at the door. Jonathan, wary, opened it to reveal Martha, the midwife, her cloak dusted with snow. She held baskets of stew and extra blankets, the warmth of her hands carrying hope. "I thought you might need these," she said softly, concern etched into her lined face. The children gathered around, their faces brightening at the sight of kindness. For the first time, Jonathan felt that the town held pockets of goodness, even amidst its harshness. Days turned to weeks, and the children began to thrive. Clara taught the youngest to read simple words from scraps of newspapers Jonathan had saved. Eli learned arithmetic with Jonathan's old ledger books. Maggie began helping in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring thick soups over the fire. Even the smallest, Jack, began toddling without fear, often reaching for Jonathan's hand in quiet assurance. Yet the shadow of the sheriff remained. Grady, increasingly frustrated by Jonathan's success, spread rumors that the children were dangerous, that Hayes's compassion was a facade. One afternoon, he confronted Jonathan at the edge of town, his boots crunching over frozen earth. "You think you're some kind of savior?" he spat. "They belong to this town. You're overstepping." Jonathan's voice was calm, but firm. "They belong to no one who cared for them. I claimed them because someone had to, and I will protect them." His eyes, storm gray and unwavering, met the sheriff's glare. For the first time, the authority figure hesitated, seeing that Jonathan was unshakable, a man no longer hollowed by grief, but fortified by purpose. The tension with the town escalated when local children began taunting Tobias and Sammy, calling them names for being bought and unwanted. Jonathan intervened, not with anger, but with lessons of dignity. "They are strong," he told them, "stronger than you know, and we will not let cruelty shape who we are." Slowly, respect grew, even among skeptics, as Jonathan's courage and steadfastness became impossible to ignore. One particularly bitter evening, Clara approached him with a question that had lingered in her mind. "Do you miss her? Your wife?" Her voice trembled, not with accusation but curiosity. Jonathan paused, looking down at the girl whose own life had been scarred by loss. He knelt to meet her eyes. Every day, he admitted, but what I feel for her now, it teaches me how to care for you all. She would have wanted this. That night, as snow painted the prairie in silver and white, Jonathan sat beside the fire while the children huddled together. They shared stories of parents lost to illness, of homes burned or abandoned, of lives broken by hardship. In the telling, a quiet miracle occurred. The children's pain softened into shared strength, their grief finding solace in one another and in the steady presence of their protector. Winter passed slowly, and with it came the subtle signs of spring. The ice began to thaw, the animals ventured out, and the children's laughter became more frequent, ringing against the wooden walls. Jonathan, too, began to smile, the tightness of sorrow loosening in small moments. Maggie's proud display of a mended boot, Eli's careful addition of firewood to the hearth, Clara reading aloud from a tattered book. Even the sheriff, grudgingly, began to notice. His visits became less confrontational, though his disapproval simmered beneath the surface. The town, witnessing the transformation, began to shift. Some merchants offered supplies discreetly. A few neighbors offered jobs or lessons for the children, recognizing that Jonathan's compassion had stirred something rare and valuable. Yet danger remained, not only from human cruelty, but from the harshness of the land itself. One afternoon, as Jonathan led the children to gather herbs and berries from the thawing prairie, a sudden rock slide echoed through the narrow canyon they were crossing. Jonathan's quick reflexes saved Sammy and Tobias from being crushed, but he himself fell, a rock grazing his shoulder, blood mixing with the snow. Panic rose in the children, but Clara's voice rang clear. "Stay calm. He's strong. He always protects us." The incident became a testament to the unbreakable bond between the widower and his children. Jonathan recovered quickly, aided by Martha's deft hands and the children's growing attentiveness. They learned not only survival, but the value of vigilance, care, and love that was active and enduring. By now, the cabin had grown more than a shelter. Jonathan expanded the space, building an additional room for the older children, constructing a small school area where reading and arithmetic flourished, and tending a garden that promised the first vegetables of spring. He taught the children to sew, to cook, to ride horses carefully, and even to defend themselves if necessary. In every lesson, the echoes of kindness and resilience took root. And yet, Jonathan never let his guard down. The West was unpredictable. The townspeople who had once whispered against him now avoided him openly, their glances wary, even fearful of the steadfast man who had claimed 10 children and refused to yield. Each day was a negotiation with cruelty, a test of courage. But the love in his cabin was a fortress, the children a living testament to the possibility of protection, care, and justice in a world that had known only neglect. As spring fully arrived, the children, once trembling and wary, emerged as a family. Clara's leadership shone, Eli's wisdom guided them, Maggie's creativity enriched daily life, and even the youngest, Jack, held a burgeoning curiosity and bravery. Jonathan, once hollowed by grief, now radiated the quiet power of a man whose purpose had been forged in hardship but softened in love. In moments of quiet, as he watched them play in the thawed prairie, he thought of Mary and whispered, "We're doing it, love. We've built something they'll never take away. Something lasting." And for the first time in years, Jonathan Hayes felt the warmth of hope, not just for the children, but for himself, an ember that could survive the harshest wind of the West. The following summer arrived with the scent of wildflowers and the low hum of the prairie wind, yet the tension that had settled over the town lingered like a shadow. Sheriff Solomon Grady had grown restless, his authority bruised by Jonathan Hayes's unwavering protection of the children. He had tried warnings, whispered threats, and veiled insults, but none had broken the bond between the widower and the 10 unwanted children who had found home in the small cabin at the edge of town. One morning, Grady rode into the prairie with a heavy hand. "Hayes," he bellowed, spurs jingling sharply, "this ends now. The town has decided those children will be returned to the auction if you cannot manage them." His voice carried over the field, startling birds into flight. But Jonathan, leaning against the doorway of the cabin, Eyes calm yet steely, did not flinch. "They are mine," he said, simply, "and they are safe. Not because of law, not because of anyone's permission, but because I choose to protect them." Grady's scowl deepened. He had underestimated the transformation, not only in Jonathan, but in the children themselves. Clara, now older and more commanding, stepped beside Jonathan, her dark hair catching the sun. "We will not be taken," she said firmly. Eli, Maggie, and the others formed a small line behind her, faces resolute. Even the youngest, Jack, clutched Jonathan's hand, his small fingers tight and confident. The confrontation rippled through the town. Some citizens, curious, came to watch. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to murmurs of respect. They saw what Jonathan had built, a family forged in hardship, resilience, and love. Grady realized he was not facing frightened children, but a community united by loyalty, courage, and the quiet moral authority of a man who had risked everything to protect them. The sheriff hesitated, frustration mixing with grudging admiration. It was Martha, stepping from the crowd with a basket of freshly baked bread, who finally softened the moment. "Solomon," she said gently, voice firm yet kind, "these children are alive, thriving. Jonathan has given them what you cannot: care, guidance, love. Isn't that the law we all should honor?" Grady ground his teeth, but finally nodded, the fire of opposition in his eyes dimming. With a heavy sigh, he turned his horse and left, the crowd dispersing with a new sense of understanding. Jonathan and the children watched, hearts lifted by the triumph of simple justice over cruelty and pride. In the days that followed, life at the cabin flourished. The children explored the prairie under Jonathan's watch, learning to fish in the thawing river, care for the animals, and tend to the garden that had begun to yield tomatoes, carrots, and beans. Laughter rang through the cabin as Maggie proudly showed off a mended doll. Tobias played hide-and-seek behind the haystacks, and Clara read aloud to the younger ones, weaving tales of courage and hope. Jonathan, once hollowed by grief, felt whole again. Each child's smile, each small triumph over adversity, was a stitch in the fabric of a family he had forged from tragedy. The ghost of his late wife, Mary, seemed present in these moments, a gentle warmth in the cabin that reminded him of love and the promise of hope. But the West had more trials in store. One afternoon, a sudden fire broke out near the prairie's edge, sparked by lightning striking a dry tree. Smoke and flames raced toward the cabin, and panic surged among the children. Jonathan acted swiftly, commanding the older children to fetch buckets from the river while he gathered blankets, livestock, and the youngest ones into a secure area. Clara guided the others with calm authority, showing a courage she had learned by watching Jonathan face adversity. Hours passed in tense, relentless effort. The children worked alongside their protector, hands raw and faces streaked with soot, but they did not waver. By sunset, the fire had been brought under control, the cabin saved, and the prairie's edge scorched but safe. Exhausted yet triumphant, Jonathan finally allowed himself to smile, the children's pride reflecting his own. As the seasons turned, the town began to recognize the quiet revolution Jonathan had wrought. Merchants brought extra supplies, neighbors offered lessons, and the sheriff, though still wary, treated the family with a respectful distance. The cabin became a sanctuary not just for the 10 children, but for the community's sense of justice and humanity, proof that kindness could withstand the harshest winds of the West. The children grew stronger, more confident, and full of life. Maggie's sewing became a small cottage industry. Eli helped Jonathan with woodworking and repairs. Tobias tended the animals with mischievous joy, and Clara continued as the guiding presence for the younger ones. Even Jack, once trembling at the wind, now ran with laughter echoing across the prairie, a living symbol of triumph over fear. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson, Jonathan sat outside the cabin with the children sprawled around him. He looked at their faces, bright, unscarred now by fear, full of trust and affection, and felt a surge of peace he had not known since Mary's passing. "You are my family," he said softly, "and nothing can change that." The children cheered, a sound that rippled across the fields and into the hearts of anyone who heard it. In that moment, the West seemed less cruel, the prairie less harsh, the world more forgiving. Jonathan had become not just a guardian, but an angel for the children, a living proof that even in the most unforgiving lands, love, courage, and resilience could flourish. Years passed, and the 10 children, once abandoned and unwanted, grew into capable, compassionate young adults. Clara became a teacher in the town, shaping the next generation with patience and wisdom. Eli became a respected craftsman, known for his meticulous work and fair dealings. Maggie opened a small sewing shop that became a hub of community kindness, while Tobias, full of laughter and mischief, became a trusted ranch hand and storyteller. Even the youngest, Jack, found his courage and curiosity guiding him toward adventures across the prairie. Jonathan, now older, with silver streaking his hair and eyes softened by years of love and loss, watched proudly as the children he had saved flourished. His cabin, once a fragile refuge, had grown into a home filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of joy that only comes from lives rebuilt from sorrow. Martha, ever faithful, visited often, smiling at the sight of 10 thriving lives, proof that one man's courage had rewritten the story of the West. And in the quiet moments as the sun set behind the hills, Jonathan remembered Mary, the love that had shaped him, and the hope that had driven him to claim 10 unwanted children at an auction that had begun in cruelty and despair. The West had tested them, the townspeople had doubted them, the sheriff had opposed them. But through it all, they had endured. The prairie wind carried laughter, the animals stirred happily in their pens, and the cabin glowed in the fading light, a beacon of kindness, courage, and the power of a heart unwilling to yield. Jonathan Hayes had become a hero, not through fame or wealth, but through the simple, unshakable act of protecting and nurturing those who had no one else. And in doing so, he had changed not just their lives, but the spirit of the West itself. The 10 children, once labeled unwanted, had grown into a family bound not by blood, but by love, resilience, and the unyielding courage of a man who refused to let cruelty dictate their fate. The town could whisper, the winds could howl, the prairie could test them endlessly, but within the walls of that small cabin, life thrived, joy prevailed, and the legacy of kindness endured. And so, in a world defined by hardship and loss, the story of Jonathan Hayes and the 10 children remained, a tale of redemption, courage, and the extraordinary power of love in the unforgiving heart of the American West.